The day Theodora Voss buried her father, she also inherited his debts. She did not cry at the graveside. There were too many people watching. The neighbours who had come to pay their respects and stayed to whisper. The creditors' men who stood at the back of the churchyard with their hats in their hands and their eyes on the house. She had learned long ago that a woman who wept in public invited pity, and pity, in her experience, had never once paid a bill. Her father, Judge Cornelius Voss, had been a man of considerable reputation and considerably less wisdom when it came to money. He had believed in the goodness of people, had lent freely, vouched often, and died with a ledger full of promises that no one intended to keep. What he left Theodora was a house on the edge of town, a library of law books she had read 3 times over, and debts that amounted to something just short of ruin. She was 28 years old. She had no husband, no brothers, and no intention of acquiring either simply to solve a financial problem. What she had was her father's practice, not the clients. Those had scattered like sparrows the moment the old judge drew his last breath. But she had the office, the files, the 15 years she had spent sitting beside her father at every hearing he would allow her to attend, taking notes while other women her age were taking dance lessons. She knew the law the way a carpenter knows wood, not from reading about it, but from handling it, from the grain of it, from what it could bear and where it would split. The town of Morrow's Bluff, Virginia, did not know what to make of a woman who intended to practice law. In 1887, this was not a thing that was done. It was barely a thing that was imagined, but Theodora Voss was not asking permission. She placed an advertisement in the Morrow's Bluff Courier. Small, composed, direct, legal counsel, reasonable rates, no case too small. She opened the office door at 8 o'clock on a Monday morning, set a pot of coffee on the stove, and waited. The first 3 weeks, no one came. The 4th week, a farmer named Elias Peck arrived with a land dispute he'd been losing for 2 years. He sat across from her with his hat in his lap and the expression of a man who had run out of better options. "You're Cornelius Voss's girl," he said. "I'm Cornelius Voss's daughter," she said. "There is a difference." He blinked. Then he handed her his papers. She won his case in 6 weeks. Word travelled the way it does in small towns. Not loudly, not as celebration, but quietly, from one worried man to another. The Voss girl knows what she's doing. It was not a ringing endorsement, but it was enough. By spring, she had 8 regular clients and a reputation that was, if not respected, at least taken seriously. By summer, she had 31. By late August, she had the strangest client she would ever receive, though she did not know it yet when he first walked through her door. He did not look like a man who needed legal help. That was the first thing she noticed. Most of her clients arrived with the particular posture of men who had been beaten down by something: a neighbour, a contract, a bad season. They carried their trouble visibly, in the set of their shoulders, in the way they reached for their hats when they sat down, as if they needed something to hold. This man sat down without fidgeting. He was perhaps 35, lean but not thin, with the kind of hands that suggested he had worked with them at some point in his life, even if he wasn't doing so now. His coat was plain, good wool, she noted, but cut without any of the decorative flourishes that well-off men in Morrow's Bluff seemed to feel were required. He gave his name as Whitmore. "Just Whitmore. First name?" she asked, her pen ready. "That'll do for now," he said pleasantly, as if he were commenting on the weather. She looked up from her ledger. He met her gaze without any of the discomfort men usually showed when she looked at them directly. Most men, when she held eye contact a beat too long, glanced away. This one did not. "I have a land matter," he said. "A parcel on the South Ridge. It belonged to my family. I believe it was acquired under false pretenses some years ago, and I'd like to see it returned." She set down her pen. "How many years ago?" 11. She kept her expression neutral, though internally she was already calculating. 11 years made it complicated. 11 years meant the original parties might be dead, the records might be incomplete, and 6 subsequent transactions might have muddied the title beyond recovery. "That's not an easy case," she said. "I know," he said. "I was told you take cases other lawyers won't." She studied him a moment. His eyes were grey, or perhaps a very dark blue. The light in her office was not generous, and they were entirely calm, not the calm of a man who didn't care about the outcome, the calm of a man who had decided on the outcome and was merely waiting for the steps to arrange themselves. "Sit down properly, Mr. Whitmore," she said, "and tell me everything." He came to her office every Tuesday and Thursday for the next 3 weeks. He was, she gradually discovered, a man of precise habits and imprecise biography. He knew the land records of Morrow's Bluff better than she did, which was unsettling, given that she had spent 2 years studying them. He could cite case precedent from memory, which was more unsettling still, and he had opinions about the interpretation of Virginia property law that were irritatingly often correct. "You've studied law," she said one afternoon. "Not quite a question." "I've had occasion to learn a great deal about a great many things," he said. He was looking at the deed she'd spread across her desk, his finger tracing the surveyor's marks. "This boundary notation is wrong, by the way. See here, the original survey would have put the creek on the east side, not the west. Someone altered this." She leaned across to look. He was right, she had missed it. She sat back in her chair, annoyed with herself and irrationally with him. "You could have been a lawyer," she said. "I could have been a great many things," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her look up. Not sadness exactly, but a kind of rueful acknowledgement, as if he were referring to a conversation that had happened long before she arrived in it. She didn't press. People came to her with the portions of themselves they chose to share, and she had learned not to demand more than they offered. But she watched him, in the way she watched everything, carefully, from a slight distance, cataloguing the details she didn't yet understand. He always arrived on foot, though the South Ridge was 3 miles out, and the August heat was no small thing. He never mentioned where he was staying, and she didn't ask, though Morrow's Bluff had only one boarding house and its proprietress. Mrs. Aubrey would have mentioned a border of his particularity to half the town by now. He seemed genuinely unbothered by the fact that she was a woman practicing law, not in the strained, deliberate way of men who were trying to be modern, but in the comfortable, unremarkable way of someone for whom this had never been a cause for comment. She found this, paradoxically, more suspicious than anything else about him. The case was more complex than she had initially calculated. The South Ridge parcel had changed hands 3 times since the original transaction 11 years ago. The first transfer she could trace clearly. It had gone from the Whitmore family holdings to a land company called the Allegheny Consolidated Trust, and the paperwork on that transfer had the particular smooth perfection of documents that had been very carefully composed after the fact. The second and third transfers were cleaner, which meant either the subsequent buyers were innocent or they had done a better job of covering their tracks. She was sitting in the county clerk's office on a Wednesday, her only non-client day, when she found the original survey contract tucked into the wrong folder. Behind it was a letter. She read it once. Then she read it again. Then she sat very still for a moment with the letter in her hands, and the sudden vertiginous sense of having stepped into something much larger than she'd understood. The letter was dated 11 years ago. It was addressed to her father. He had known about the fraudulent transfer. He had been asked, gently, in the careful language of men who made polite requests that were not requests at all, to look the other way. And there was a second letter clipped behind the first, in her father's handwriting. An acknowledgement, not a refusal. She sat with that for a long moment. Her father had been a man of considerable reputation. He had also been a man with debts, and a daughter he worried about, and a world that did not make it easy for worried men with debts to refuse requests that came with money attached to them. She put both letters in her case. She walked home. She did not speak to anyone on the way, which was unusual for her. She was not by nature a woman who passed her neighbours without greeting. But she needed to think, and she thought best when she was not required to perform normalcy. By the time she reached her front door, she had made her decision. Whitmore was already at the office when she arrived on Thursday morning, sitting on the step with his coat folded across his knees and a cup of coffee from the bakery next door. He stood when he saw her face. "What did you find?" he said. She unlocked the door without answering. Inside, she set her case on the desk, extracted the 2 letters, and laid them before him without comment. He read them standing up. She watched him read, watched the stillness of his expression, the particular quality of attention he gave to each line. When he finished, he did not look up immediately. He set the letters down with great care, as if they were something that might break if handled roughly, and then he was quiet for a moment that stretched a beat longer than comfortable. "Your father," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," she said, more sharply than she intended. She softened her voice. "He wasn't a bad man. He was a man who was afraid, which is not the same thing. I've learned to tell the difference." She paused. "I need to know something, Mr. Whitmore. Is there anything else you haven't told me? Because if I'm going to use this," she indicated the letters, "in a proceeding, I need to understand exactly what I'm walking into." He looked at her then. There was something in his expression she hadn't seen before, a weighing, a calculation not unkind. "You deserve to know," he said slowly. "I've been deciding how much to tell you." "Tell me all of it," she said. "I've been practicing law in a town that didn't want me to practice law for a year and a half. I can manage most things." He sat down in the chair across from her desk. He put his elbows on his knees and his hands together, and he looked at the floor for a moment, and then he said, "My full name is Crispin Aldwyn Whitmore, Earl of Braymore." The office was very quiet. Outside, she could hear the baker's boy calling deliveries down the street. "The land on the South Ridge," he continued, "was part of a parcel my grandfather purchased in 1851 during one of his American ventures. It was never enormously significant to the earldom. It's not a working property, but it was his, and it was taken from his estate by fraud, and my family has been trying to recover it through the English courts for a decade without success. Because the people who took it were careful enough to conduct all the relevant transactions on American soil." He looked up. "I came here myself because the solicitors weren't getting anywhere, and because I was." He paused. "I was told a local attorney with particular knowledge of the county records might accomplish more than a letter from London." She was quiet for a moment. "And you didn't think to lead with that," she said. "Would you have taken the case differently if I had?" "I would have known what I was actually dealing with," she said. "You found what I needed you to find," he said. "You did it the way you do everything, thoroughly, without being distracted by things that didn't matter." "I didn't want to distract you." "You didn't want me to be distracted," she repeated, and something in her voice made him have the grace to look briefly uncomfortable. "Mr. Whitmore, my lord, I have spent a year and a half making a case that I am a competent legal professional, despite the fact that I am a woman. Do you understand what it costs me when a client decides paternally what information I can handle?" The silence that followed was a different quality of silence than before. "Yes," he said, "I do understand, and I apologize. It wasn't meant as paternalism. It was habit of a kind. Being careful about who knows what, the burden of a title," she said, and did not keep all of the edge out of her voice. "In part," he said, he met her gaze directly, "and in part because Morrow's Bluff is a small town, and I've found that when people know I have a certain weight behind my name, they begin behaving differently. They stop telling me the truth. They tell me what they think I want to hear." A slight pause. "You never did that." She looked at him for a long moment. He was not wrong as a matter of observation. She had argued with him 6 times in 3 weeks about points of property law, and on 3 of those occasions she had been the one who was correct, and she had told him so without softening it. "No," she said, "I did not." They filed the suit 2 weeks later. What followed was the busiest 4 months of Theodora's professional life. The Allegheny Consolidated Trust turned out to be a shell company for a considerably larger concern with considerably more legal resources than a single attorney in a small Virginia town. They sent 3 lawyers from Richmond. She sent back responses that she wrote by lamplight after her regular clients had gone home, that were precise and methodical and cited precedent that the Richmond lawyers, she suspected, had to look up. Crispin, she had begun to think of him by his given name, though she was careful about when she used it, remained in Morrow's Bluff. He had told her this had to do with the case requiring his presence for certain filings. She suspected this was true, but not the complete truth, and she was too busy to pursue the distinction. He helped. This was unexpected, and she found genuinely useful. He could not represent the case himself, but he could read documents with the focused, informed attention of someone who had spent a great deal of time dealing with exactly this kind of legal maneuvering in a different jurisdiction. He caught errors she was too tired to catch. He brought coffee to the office on late afternoons without being asked, and without making it into something it wasn't. Without the self-consciousness of a man performing a gesture. Just a man who had noticed that coffee was needed and had gone to get it. She noticed this about him. She noticed a number of things about him. In the careful and undemonstrative way, she noticed things that mattered to her. He noticed things about her too. She became aware of this gradually, in the way he asked questions, not about the case but about her, about what had made her decide to open an office, rather than take the easier path of marrying someone who would manage the debts. About the law books she'd read 3 times over, about the case that had first made her understand that she was good at this, genuinely good, in a way that had nothing to do with her father's name. "You love it," he said one evening. It was October by then. The maple outside the office window turned orange, the light going early. He had asked her something about the Peck case, the land dispute that had started everything, and she had answered at more length than she'd intended. "I do," she said, a little defensively, as if expecting the observation to be followed by some diminishment of it. It wasn't. "It shows," he said simply. "When you're explaining something about the law, your voice changes. You sound like yourself." She looked at him. As opposed to how you sound when you're managing how you come across," he said. "You do that quite a lot. I expect you've had to." She said nothing for a moment, because this was accurate in a way that it was strange to hear stated. "I expect you know something about that," she said finally. "Managing how I come across?" He smiled briefly. "I know a great deal about it. They won the case in December. The judge, not from Morrow's Bluff, but from Staunton, the nearest large court that could properly hear the matter, ruled in favour of the Whitmore family claim, finding that the original 1876 transfer had been executed on the basis of a fraudulent survey and a falsified acknowledgement. The letters Theodora had found in the county clerk's office were entered into evidence. Her father's name appeared in the record. She had prepared herself for this to be painful. It was, but less than she'd feared. The record showed what it showed. A man who had been pressured and had yielded to pressure once, in a matter that had not involved his own client's interests. It did not make him a good man, exactly. It made him a complicated one. She had been learning to hold that. Crispin was standing beside her when the judgment was read. He was very still. In the way she had learned, meant something mattered to him. Afterward, outside the courthouse in the thin December light, he said, "Thank you, Miss Voss. It's my job," she said, though this particular case had come with a flat fee and no promises, and they both knew it. "It's more than that," he said, "and you know it." A pause. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to tell me honestly if the answer is no." She turned to look at him. "I'm going back to England in January," he said. "The estate has been, let's say, somewhat neglected in my absence. There are matters that require attention." He was looking at her with the same quality of directness he'd turned on her since the first day, the same unhurried steadiness. "I would like to write to you, if you'll allow it." She was quiet for a moment. The street was cold, the bare trees casting long shadows. "Letters," she said. To start," she repeated. She considered this, considered what it meant, what it might lead to, what the complications of it were, which were considerable and varied, and included, not least, the gap between a woman who had a legal practice in a small Virginia town and a man who held an earldom in England. She considered these things the way she considered everything, systematically, without flinching from the less convenient parts. "All right," she said. "You may write." He wrote. His letters were, characteristically, not what she had expected. She had anticipated. She was not sure what she had anticipated. Something formal, perhaps. Something that kept a careful distance. Instead, he wrote the way he spoke, directly, without performing anything. He wrote about the estate, which was large and draughty, and full of his grandmother's furniture, and a great deal of deferred maintenance that he was working through with the methodical patience of someone who understood that neglected things required time. He wrote about the law cases in England that reminded him of arguments they'd had about Virginia property law. He wrote once about standing in the South Ridge parcel after the judgment was filed, in the early morning, when the frost was still on the ground, that it had felt less like reclaiming property than like keeping a promise to his grandfather, whom he had loved. She wrote back. This surprised her, not the act of writing, But what she wrote, which was more honest than her usual register. She wrote about a case she'd taken in January, a widow fighting an eviction. She wrote about the way the other lawyers in the county had started, slowly and without much warmth, to acknowledge her existence. She wrote about the library, still full of her father's law books, and how she was gradually making peace with the fact that she had loved him and he had been imperfect, and both things were completely true. March became May. May became July. The letters came every 2 weeks, and she had begun to rely on them in a way she hadn't entirely authorized herself to. In August, nearly a year after she had won his case, he wrote to tell her he would be returning to Virginia. Land matters, he said. He looked forward to discussing them in person. She read this letter sitting at her father's old desk in the office that was now unambiguously hers. Her books on the shelves now, her cases in the files, her name on the door. She read it twice. Then she set it on the desk and sat with it for a moment in the August afternoon, the same maple outside the window that had been orange in October, now deep green and throwing shade across the floor. She found she was smiling. He arrived on a Thursday. He looked the same plain good coat, the same quality of attention, the same particular stillness that she had catalogued over the past year in more detail than she had intended to. He sat in the same chair across from her desk and looked at her with the expression that was neither performed ease nor performed distance, but simply himself, and she thought, not for the first time, that this was a rare thing, to know what a person was like before you knew who they were. "The land matter," she said. "The land matter," he agreed, with a slight curve to his mouth that indicated they both knew the land matter was not the primary reason for his presence in Morrow's Bluff, Virginia. "I've been thinking," she said, "about something you told me, about how people behave differently when they know you have weight behind your name. I remember. I want to tell you something honestly." She paused, composing it. "I don't particularly care about the title. I didn't think about it during the case, and I have not thought about it much since. What I thought about, and what I have thought about since, is the man who sat in that chair and caught the errors I was too tired to catch, and who was right about the boundary notation the first time I was wrong, and who asked me questions about my work as if the answers interested him. As if I interested him." He was very still, listening. "But I also need to say," she continued, "that I am not going anywhere. I don't mean this unkindly. I think you have known it, but I am saying it plainly so that we are not confused about it. This is my practice. This town is where I have built something, and I am not finished building it. I will not be the Countess of Braymore in the way you might need a countess to be. And if that is what you are actually looking for when you think about writing letters and land matters, and returning to Virginia, then I am telling you now, so that you can look elsewhere without having wasted more time." The room was very quiet. "Theodora," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name in her presence, and it landed differently than she had imagined, which was probably information. "Do you know why I came here myself instead of sending another solicitor? You said the solicitors weren't." "They weren't," he said, "but that wasn't the whole of it." He looked at her steadily. "I came because I had spent a decade at that estate managing things at a remove, through letters, through agents, through every variety of intermediary that the English aristocracy has invented to ensure that an earl need never deal with anything directly, and I found that I had lost. Not the estate. The estate was fine. I had lost some sense of what I was doing any of it for." He paused. "I came to Virginia because it was something I could do with my own hands, and I found more than I expected to find." She did not look away. He did not look away either. "I am not looking for a countess," he said. "I am looking for a woman who will tell me when I am wrong about the boundary notation, who will not soften things because my name has weight behind it, who loves what she does the way you love what you do." A pause. "If she also happens to be willing to visit Braymore once a year and tolerate the grandmother's furniture, that would be more than I would have thought to ask for." Theodora Voss, who had not cried at her father's graveside when half the county was watching, felt something shift behind her sternum, not dramatically, not with any of the theatrical quality she might have expected from a moment like this one, just a slow settling, like a foundation stone finding its level. "I have always wanted to see England," she said. "It's cold," he said, And the plumbing is unreliable. I manage unreliable things for a living, she said. He smiled. It was a different smile than the slight curves she had catalogued. Over 3 weeks and 12 months of letters. Full and unguarded, and entirely his. They were married in April, in the small church in Morrow's Bluff, with Elias Peck in attendance and Mrs. Aubrey from the boarding house, and a respectable number of the clients Theodora had acquired over 2 years of making herself indispensable to people who had initially doubted her. The ceremony was brief. The reception was at the office, because the office had more room than the house, and because Theodora had decided that there was no reason her professional life and her personal life could not occupy the same space, since they already occupied the same person. She kept the practice. She brought in a junior associate, a young woman from Roanoke who had read law under her father, who came recommended and proved herself in the first month by finding a discrepancy in a title search that would have cost a client $300. Theodora liked her immediately. She visited Braemore in October. It was, as advertised, cold, the kind of deep, stone-wall cold that Virginia houses did not achieve. And the grandmother's furniture was everywhere, floral and inescapable, and the plumbing made sounds in the night that she could not account for. She spent one morning in the estate's library and discovered that the previous Earl had owned 3 treatises on American property law, which she had not expected, and which made her feel inexplicably and completely at home. Crispin watched her move through the library, pulling books off shelves, and she pretended not to notice him watching. And he pretended not to be watching, and this was the texture of how they were with each other. Honest about the things that mattered, quietly indulgent about the small deceits that made life comfortable. She was not the Countess of Braemore in the official sense. She did not chair the charitable committees, or take her place at the county dinners, or perform any of the social architecture that the title theoretically required. She was Theodora Voss, whose name was on the door of a law office in Virginia, who visited England in the autumn, and returned to Morrow's Bluff in November, when the winter cases were beginning to stack up on her desk. The people of Morrow's Bluff adjusted to this situation with the philosophical pragmatism of a small town that has seen stranger things and would prefer to have a competent attorney available. Her clients did not particularly care about the earldom. They cared that she won their cases. She continued to win them. Many years later, when her junior associate had become her partner and was beginning to take the more complex cases, someone asked Theodora what it had been like. The year of the South Ridge parcel, the fraudulent transfers, the man who had turned up in her office without a first name and left something in her life that she had not known was missing. She thought about it for a moment. He was right about the boundary notation, she said. From the very first week, I should have listened sooner. It was not, perhaps, the romantic answer, but it was the true one, and Theodora Voss had built her entire life on the conviction that true and romantic were not, in the end, incompatible. Only that the true part had to come first.